The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Most fans consider the home run the true mark of a hitter's brilliance. Not only does the homer have tremendous gate appeal, but when hit in a walk-off manner, provides fans with some of the most extraordinary drama that occurs on the baseball diamond. Of course, the hitter most often associated with the home run is Babe Ruth of the New York Yankees, the Sultan of SWAT, who redefined the national pastime with his majestic four-baggers, ushering in the so-called lively ball era of the game. But here in Philadelphia, there was another player whose name became synonymous with the home run a decade before Ruth usurped the title. His name was Frank Home Run Baker, and he played third base for Connie Mack's Athletics during the dead ball era when home runs were less common. Baker, who was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1955, played a total of 13 major league seasons with a career batting average of .307, 103 triples, 96 home runs, and 991 RBI. Barry Sparks, author of Frank Home Run Baker, Hall of Famer, and World Series hero, is our guest, and he will give us some insight into the life and career of this early home run hitter. Welcome to the podcast, Barry.
Thank you, Bill. I'm glad to be here.
Barry, I couldn't help but be fascinated by your explanation of how you became interested in Frank Home Run Baker. Tell me, how did this journey begin? Why did you write the book?
Well, Bill, I was born in Cambridge, Maryland, which is about 7 miles from Trapp, Maryland, where Home Run Baker was born and lived all of his life. And as a young baseball fan, I was very aware of Frank Home Run Baker. So I knew his name, I knew his exploits, and as a matter of fact, in 1960, I was 11 years old, and Frank Baker was one of the guests at the Little League banquet, along with Philly pitcher Chris Short. And I got a baseball signed by both Frank Home Run Baker and Chris Short, took it home, put it up on the mantle, and it stayed there. I'm not sure how long, but I know what happened to it. And it was one day in the summertime we were having our traditional baseball game in the big field across from my house, and the ball we had, we lost it or it came unraveled or something, but we needed a baseball to continue the game. And I said, hey, guys, I know where one is. Ran home, got the ball off the mantle, and that Frank Home Run Baker and Chris Short signed ball helped extended our game that afternoon, but it was quite a loss looking back.
But that Baker stayed with you, so you had some unfinished business, didn't you?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And as I was going along, in 1970, I think I was a sophomore in college at Towson State University, and I actually wrote Mrs. Baker a letter and said, I'd like to come down and interview you sometime. And I had no idea what I was going to do with this interview, but I knew I wanted to interview her. And I went down, and I did talk to her that afternoon, and probably for half hour, 45 minutes. And I guess it was maybe a year later, I had an article in Baseball Digest on the triple, matter of fact. And Bill Mobley, who was the sports editor of the Cambridge Daily Banner, invited me to write a column for the paper, and we called it Spotlighting the Past, and mainly dealing with the history of baseball, local and national. And the first article I ever wrote was about Frank Home Run Baker. So I've always had that connection. And then as time went on, I kept thinking, boy, nobody ever wrote a book on Home Run Baker, and he really deserves one. And I was really tired of reading the same cursory paragraph about Baker. It would be the same thing every time I read it. And I finally thought, well, maybe I should do a book. And I said, I probably don't have time to do a book when I'm working and doing other things. And finally my wife got tired of hearing me talk, and she said, just do it. And with that in mind, the just do it, I headed to Reading Library to start to do my research on Home Run Baker. And it took me about 9 years to get the finished product, but I've learned a lot about Home Run Baker, and somebody asked me once the book came out, they said, why hasn't anybody ever written a book about Home Run Baker before? And I said, because it's too darn hard. And that's very much the truth. You've written a lot more books than I have, and you know how difficult that is to do. A lot of readers aren't aware of all the research that takes place, and of course with Home Run Baker there weren't people that it could really interview that had played with him, or some people that knew him, but I was you could tell what type of person Home Run Baker was pretty quickly, but there was nobody who had actually played with him that I could have interviewed in say 1996 or around there.
Right. The book is very well researched, and what I really appreciate about it is the context that you give the readers, starting with the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which was a hotbed of baseball talent, as you point out, in the late 19th century. And in fact, you point out that some former major leaguers played on Eastern Shore teams. And many of the younger players were heavily scouted by pro clubs from Washington, Baltimore, New York, and Philadelphia. Baker, as a teenager, played for several Eastern Shore teams, including Pocomoke, Ridgely, and Cambridge. And you tell us that Jack Dunn, the owner and manager of the Baltimore Orioles, saw Baker play and dismissed him as clumsy, awkward, and light-hitting. But a year or so later, Baker plays for Reading, Pennsylvania, of the Tri-State League, and he catches the attention of Connie Mack, who signed him for the A's. Now, Barry, what did Connie Mack see in Baker that Jack Dunn so obviously missed?
Well, everybody says Baker could always hit, and I think that's the thing that always separated him. Buck Herzog, who was kind of a mentor to Baker, actually switched him from an outfielder pitcher to third base. And he said, well, Baker wasn't that great of a third baseman, and he certainly couldn't play the outfield, and he wasn't much of a pitcher, but boy, could he hit. So his hitting prowess is the thing that attracted attention. Plus, he was fast. He was always described as kind of slow and clumsy, awkward looking, but he had speed, and he was very intelligent on the bases. And of course, back in that era, that was very important, that that you had to know how to run the bases, you had to be smart on the bases. And that's the other thing. He was a smart baseball player, and he was very dependable, very steady, and I think that's what Mack saw. Plus, Mack was revamping his team. He had an older team, and he was collecting younger players, and Baker fit right into that. Jimmy Collins, who was in the Hall of Fame, had been an earlier third baseman before Baker got there, but he was old and in decline, and so Baker fit right into that youth movement, so to say.
Mm-hmm. Now, for our younger listeners, when we're referring to the era, we're referring to the dead ball era, and this was a time period in baseball history where they played station-to-station baseball. The hit and run, the bunt, the steal, the inside game, so to speak, was dominant. And home runs were, I won't say rare, but they weren't all that common, and the ball was, in fact, heavier, hence the dead ball era, which is very different from the subsequent era that Babe Ruth ushered in, called the lively ball era, when the ball was jackrabbited and was just jumping out of parks. Now, many of the ball players of the dead ball era were very hard-living, rowdy, colorful personalities. Now, apparently Baker wasn't like that. You write that Frank Baker was quiet, modest, and shy. And this is a quote, like the storybook version of the country boy he was. And you also point out that he didn't smoke, drink, or curse. So my question logically is, even though Mac was going through a youth movement, as you pointed out, how on earth did he fit into the A's team chemistry, which was pretty diverse? Because at that time there were some dim-witted roustabouts like Shoeless Joe Jackson. Right. On the one hand, there were former collegians like Eddie Plank, Harry Davis, Eddie Collins, Jack Combs, and even an American Indian of Chief Bender. So it doesn't seem like Baker would be a natural on a team like that. How did he fit in with them?
Well, one thing about Frank Baker is that he could get along with anybody. He was good friends with the guys on the team that were college educated, like Eddie Collins. He could get along with, like you say, guys like Shoeless Joe Jackson, who had very little education. Frank Baker himself didn't have a whole lot of education, but he was still a smart guy. But he wasn't. He didn't have an ego. Didn't have to have things evolve around him. And I think he just knew how to get along with people. And like I say, he's a quiet guy. Didn't stir things up, and so he fit in very well that way. And he was lifelong friends with a lot of his teammates on the A's, guys like Eddie Collins and Eddie Plank and Wally Shine, the catcher. They would go hunting and fishing during the off season, and so he got along with everybody pretty well, as far as I can tell. You talked about the dead ball era a little bit, and for your listeners who aren't as familiar with that era, I would just say that one is it was pitching dominated. And I just have a stat that the newer baseball fans would be startled by. Now, this is just in 1910. For the Philadelphia A's pitching staff, they had 123 complete games. They tossed 24 shutouts and had a staff ERA of 1.79. Now, we know today that that if the whole league had 20 complete games, that would probably be something special. So you talked about the home run, and the home run rate in 1909 was one home run for every 329 at-bats. Last time I looked, in today's game, it was like one home run for 30 at-bats. Wow. And when we talk about a home run, most of the home runs in the dead ball era were inside the park home runs. Mm-hmm. And there were 4 times as many triples as there were homers. And if your listeners can think about this, is that most of the time, only one ball was used for the entire game.
Right.
So he didn't throw it out after every nick or anything else like that. Sometimes players would spit tobacco on the ball to blacken the ball or darken the ball, making it harder for the batter to see. And of course, you could throw the spitball at that time. And so all those things made for a very difficult power game. And as you said, it was steals, advancing the runners. Those were all very important elements of dead ball era. Plus, the ballparks were much, much bigger than what they are today.
So the home run also, as you mentioned, there were many inside the parkers, but there were also what we would call many ground rule doubles that were home runs back at that time. In other words, you didn't have to hit the ball out of the park. It could bounce, once and then out of the park, and that was still considered a home run, correct?
Mm-hmm. I believe that is right, but you realize even to bounce a ball over the fence then took a lot of power. When Shibe Park opened in 1909, mm-hmm. Get this, the left field distance is 378 feet, mm-hmm. Center field 515 feet, and right field 340 feet.
That's right.
So,
gargantuan numbers.
Yeah. Citizens Bank Park is 50 feet shorter to the left field, about 100 feet shorter to center field, and just 10 feet shorter to right field. So
clearly
it took a poke.
Yeah, it did. Now, given the scarcity of home runs in the dead ball era, I want you to talk about how Baker acquired his name of home run, because according to his bronze plaque in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, Baker, and this is a quote, won 2 World Series games from the New York Giants in 1911 with home runs, thus getting the name Home Run Baker, end of quote. Now this has become a well-accepted piece of baseball lore, but it isn't quite accurate. So tell us, how did Baker actually acquire his nickname?
Okay, and Bill, you're right that certainly the home runs were a rarity, and I just kind of to set this up to let you know, in 1909 when Shibe Park opened, the newspaper said, boy, the first player who ever hits a home run over the fence will be remembered forever because it'll be quite a feat. Well, early in the season, Baker hit a grand slam over the right field fence in Shibe Park, which was I believe it was the first home run in Shibe Park. And because it went over the fence, it created a stir around the league that the league talked about for 2 weeks. The fact that he had put a ball over the fence. So to set this up in 1911, of course, the A's are playing the New York Giants with John McGraw as the manager, Christy Matheson and Rube Marquardt are the star pitchers. And the 1911 World Series was just a fantastic series. It was a frenzy in New York and Philadelphia, and when I was doing research and I read the accounts in the newspapers, it was unbelievable, the crowds and the excitement. And the 1911 World Series was the most covered World Series at the time. So they had a lot of the reporters there. It got great coverage, and most of the sports writers favored the New York Giants. And of course, the Giants and the A's had met in 1905 World Series, and the Giants had dominated the A's. Christy Matheson won 3 games, so there was a lot of tension before the game ever started. So in Game 1, the turning point of Game 1 came in the 3rd inning, and Baker came to the bat, and there were 2 men on, and Eddie Collins was one of the runners on base, and he was on second base, and it ended up that, Matheson struck Baker out, and he pretty much fooled him on the pitch, and Matheson afterwards said that was the key to the game, striking Baker out with 2 men on base. So Game 2, it's Rube Marquardt, who left-handed pitcher, won 20 games that year. The game's tied 6-6. If the game's tied 1-1 in the 6th inning, and Eddie Collins is again on second base. Now, Eddie Collins had the reputation of being a great sign stealer, and people thought that he would often steal the sign and let Baker know what pitch was coming. And so McGraw had said to the Giants, we're not throwing any fastballs to Baker. He's a dead pull fastball hitter, no fastball. So Keith Myers, the Giants catcher, goes out to the mound, and he tells Marquardt, the next 2 pitches throw curves no matter what sign I put down. So the next 2 pitches, Myers signals for fastballs. And Marquardt, following directions, throws curves. Well, now he thinks he can sneak a fastball by Baker. And he throws a fastball. Boom, Baker hits a home run over the right field fence. The crowd goes crazy because the game's in Philadelphia. And they end up winning the game, and that's the key blow. And Christy Matheson, who's writing a column for the newspapers, he puts all the blame on Marquardt, saying he was careless, he didn't follow directions, and So Marquardt felt bad, and Matheson just put it on him a little bit more. So in Game 3, it's Matheson pitching. It's in Polo Grounds, and it is tied in the top of the ninth. Matheson gets 2 strikes on Baker with curves, and then he thinks the same way that Marquardt thought. Maybe I can get a fastball past Baker. So he tries it. Baker lines the pitch over the right field fence, ties the game 2-2. Matheson is so mad he kicks the dirt on the mound, and as Baker's going around touching the bases at the Polo Grounds, it's so quiet he said he could hear every footstep.
Wow.
And Matheson said, I have no excuse, and because Baker had hit home runs against Rube Marquardt and Christy Matheson, 2 guys that were 20-game winners and thought to be the aces of the staff, he became an instant hero overnight. And Matheson had only allowed 1 run in 44 innings against the A's going back to the 1905 World Series, so you can see how dominant he was. And really, Baker became a star overnight. I don't mean just a star in Philadelphia. I mean a national star. And so the A's win the World Series. Baker hits .375 for this series, has 5 RBIs and 9 hits, 7 runs. And he is forever now known as Frank Home Run Baker. And so I always like to say to people, hey, no matter how many home runs Babe Ruth hit, that nickname of home run was already taken.
Absolutely. And I did understand that nickname was every bit as acknowledging of the pitchers that he hit those home runs off of as the actual home runs themselves, because the Marquardt and Matheson being the victims of those long balls, it really did launch him, as you say, into the national spotlight. So thanks for clearing that up.
And the pressure in the World Series, as we all know, I mean, that is where you really earn your keep, how you perform in big games. And Baker was unflappable. He was steady, didn't get shook up, and the fact that he did it in the spotlight made it even more important.
Now, to give listeners an idea of just how exceptional Baker was as a hitter, consider a couple things. During Mac's first championship dynasty, which went from 1910 to 1914, the A's captured 3 world championships and 4 American League pennants. Baker was clearly the indisputable power hitter of those teams. In that 5-year period, he hit a total of 45 home runs and 525 RBI while hitting, and this is unheard of for a power hitter, at least today, hitting .324 in that 5-year period with an on-base percentage of .387, a slugging percentage of .475, and an OPS, which is on-base plus slugging percentage, of .856. Now, we'll give that fact that the home run numbers averaged only 9 per season. He led the American League in homers for those 5 seasons, but the other stats are truly impressive for any era of baseball history, including today. And what impresses me even more was your description of Baker's 52-ounce black bat. You write that it was, quote, almost like a piece of steel, being short with a thick handle that was as round as the barrel, and that there was no flex in it, which makes me wonder how Baker could have produced those numbers.
It was pretty incredible, wasn't it? And on the cover of the book is Baker with that 52-ounce bat, and I know that Dick Allen used a 42-ounce bat, and that was much heavier than the current players use, and Baker's was 52. And one of the things is that Baker was so powerful, muscular. He was what I call farm boy strong. He grew up on the farm. He was used to hard work, and he was stronger than most players in the league. And you talked about his numbers, and Bill, you're right on when you talk about his all-round numbers and how good he was. And I just wanted to add that in that 5-year period from 1910 to 1914, when he had 525 RBIs, that was second in Major League Baseball to Sam Crawford of the Tigers.
Wow.
So Baker led the league in RBIs in 1912 and 1913. And he was also the best third baseman in the American League in those 5 years. Now, what I just want to share with you is Baker's 1912 season. And that is often overlooked because the A's did not win the pennant that year. And it was a very disappointing year as well. I'm sure you're well aware of. But this is what Frank Baker did in 1912. He batted .347. He had 200 hits, 116 runs, 130 RBIs, 40 doubles, 21 triples, and 40 stolen bases.
Unbelievable.
Now think about that. No third baseman surpassed his 130 RBIs until Eddie Matthews had 135 in 1953. So for 42 years, no third baseman had more RBIs than 130, and Baker did that in 1912. And no other third baseman was able to duplicate what he did, double figures in doubles, triples, stolen bases, until George Brett did it for the Kansas City Royals. So
this is a five-tool player, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly from your book, Baker was only about 5'10" and 170 pounds. Is that correct?
That's right, 5'11", 175 pounds. Now, it's interesting that one person said, but he looked a lot bigger in a uniform than when he was in his street clothes. But I think it was that being so strong, having grown up on the farm, and he worked on the farm. During the off season, that's what he did. He had a number of farms, and so you're right. He was a five-tool player, often overlooked for those other skills because of his home run power. But when you think that a guy can hit 21 triples and get 40 stolen bases, while driving in 130 RBIs, I mean, it was pretty incredible. So, yes, he was, and like I say, in today's terms, he would clearly be a superstar.
Mm-hmm. Now, Baker's time in Philadelphia ended in turmoil. After the A's were upset by the Miracle Braves of Boston in the 1914 World Series, Mack held a fire sale. And among the first to go was Frank Baker, who he sold to the Yankees for $35,000. And by the way, that figure would be more than $787,000 today. Now, faced with the prospect of playing even further away from his home on Maryland's Eastern Shore, Baker refused to report to New York, and he played semi-pro ball instead. Two questions for you, Barry. Number one, why did Mack get rid of Baker after the 1914 season? And number two, why did Baker have a change of heart and report to the Yankees in 1916?
Okay, well, let me start out by first saying that Mack did not sell Baker to the Yankees until 1916.
Okay.
Matter of fact, Mack and Baker, their feud was so bitter that Mack said, I wouldn't sell Baker for $1 million. So the background for that is that Baker had signed a new 3-year contract in 1914.
Wow.
With the idea that if he wanted to retire before the end of that contract, he could. Well, after the 1914 season, which you had described as being chaotic and everything else, Mack started to break up the team. And he announced at the February Sports Writers banquet that Baker had announced that he was retiring from baseball. And Baker said, well, I really, they thought, well, maybe this was Baker trying to get a new contract out of Mack, because he had signed that 3-year contract for the same amount of money that he was making in 1913, and he realized he was probably underpaid and everything. But so the Yankees early on had offered $25,000 for Baker, and Mack wanted $50,000. Now they were at an impasse, and there were other teams that were interested in Baker, but Baker said he wasn't going to play. And Baker goes to Mack, and he says, now, I'm not planning on playing for the A's this year, but do you mind if I play for a local team or local ball? Which Mack said, sure. Mack's figuring he's going to play on the Eastern Shore. Well, then Baker announces he's going to play for Upland, which is only 10 miles south of Philadelphia.
That's right.
And Mack is livid because he sees his attendance going out the window, and he says, this is when he says, I wouldn't sell Baker for $1 million. So they're at loggerheads, and Baker's getting paid very well to play for Upland because John Crozier, millionaire from that area, liked him and paid him a lot of money. Clark Griffith of the Senators said Baker was the biggest ingrate ever. He was just a money grubber and all like that. So there was a real battle there. And matter of fact, of course, the Federal League was courting Baker at this time. And of course, Max says, well, look, you're still under contract. You can't play for another team. And so it was very frustrating, but it was a real battle there. And as nice as those two guys were separately, they were very, very bitter about this. And so finally in February, which was almost 1 year later to the date that his retirement was announced, that's when Max sold Baker to the Yankees for $37,500, which, doing the math, is exactly halfway between the $25,000 that the Yankees offered a year before, and Max saying he wanted $50,000. So that's how Baker ended up going to the Yankees, and he passed up several opportunities to go and sign with the Federal League. But it was a very bitter feud between the two. But later they said they buried the hatchet, and they seemed to get along after that.
Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, Baker and Babe Ruth, who would become the new home run king, played together for 2 seasons in New York, 1921 and 22, although Baker's playing time dwindled. But those 2 seasons were bittersweet for Baker. In fact, he complained about the new quote-unquote rabbit ball, saying that the ball used in the 1920s traveled much further than the ball used for the majority of his career in the so-called dead ball era. Sounds a little like jealousy. How did Baker and Ruth get along, Barry?
Well, I tell you, I don't think Baker was jealous of the Babe at all. They knew each other. They went way back to 1914 when Ruth was a pitcher with Baltimore. And during an exhibition game, Baker he went 4 for 5 off of Ruth, who was, I think, 19 years old at the time. So although they were very different, like day and night, Babe respected Baker and Baker respected Babe Ruth. And at one point, Baker says, I hope to live long enough to see Ruth hit 100 home runs in the season. He's by far better than anybody else out here. And you talk about the lively ball, and in 1922, I believe it is, Baker hit 7 home runs in the first couple months of the season, and he's actually on track to hit 28 homers, which is far more than he ever hit before. But in June of that year, in a game against the Browns, Urban Shocker hit him in the ribs and broke 3 of his ribs, and Baker missed the final 2 months of the season. and I think he ended up with like 9 home runs or something like that when he played in 69 games. So Baker understood about getting a upswing on the ball like Ruth did, but that wasn't his game. There's accounts of Baker practicing, lofting the ball in the air more, but he was a line drive hitter, and he didn't go that route. And of course, by the time he was with the Yankees, he was 35, 36 years old, so certainly his power was in decline. And in 1916, his first year with the Yankees, he actually ran into an iron gate chasing a foul ball and broke his ribs. And he said after that, his swing and his power was never the same. So it would have been nice if Baker would have had completely healthy seasons with the Yankees, but he didn't. And in 1921, I think there was 4 times that Baker and Ruth homered in the same game, and that was kind of like bringing together the home run champs of different eras, So I think that they both respected each other, even though they were very different.
Well, that's actually refreshing for me to hear, because there are some baseball historians who have painted Baker like another Ty Cobb in his relationship to Babe Ruth. Ty Cobb belittled Babe Ruth, saying basically that any moron can hit a home run, and near the end of Cobb's career, which, by the way, happened with the Philadelphia Athletics in 1927 and 28, he even proved that he could hit the home run if he wanted to, and he said that he just didn't want to. And there are some baseball historians that basically said that there was that kind of jealousy on Baker's part, and I noted that explanation that you just gave in your book. So I'm glad that you straightened that out. There's another, I think, misconception that I was interested to see that you addressed in your book, and it deals with Baker and Jimmy Foxx. Baker retired after the 1922 season and turned briefly to managing the Eastern Farmers of the Eastern Shore League for the 1924 and 25 seasons. Now, you point out that Baker discovered Jimmy Foxx and sold him to Connie Mack for $2,000, giving the A's their next great power hitter. But many baseball historians say that the Yankees were also interested in Foxx, but Baker sold them to the A's to spite New York. Is any of that true?
Well, here's how it worked. Frank Baker, Jimmy Foxx was dropped into Frank Baker's lap when Frank Baker was the manager of Easton. It wasn't that Baker was out somewhere and he discovered Foxx. Fox's father, Del Fox, came to see Frank Baker one day and said, "Hey, my son is a pretty doggone good ball player." At the time, Jimmy Foxx was 16, pretty much a farm boy again, and I'd like for him to, you take a look at him and see if he can play for you. And so Baker says, "Send him over to me." And of course, he takes one look at Jimmy Foxx and he says, "Yeah, I can work with this," And so he helps Foxx with his hitting and everything. And so it was apparent that Foxx was a standout and, had a lot of potential. He was still very young. And actually, the New York Giants were scouting Jimmy Foxx, and when Baker sold him to the A's, he just got ahead of the Giants signing Foxx. But the way that Baker tells the story is that Baker went to, I'm not sure if it was, probably went to Philadelphia when the Yankees and the A's were playing, and he walked into the Yankee dugout, and Miller Huggins was there, and Babe Ruth, and of course, since Baker had played for Huggins, and that was his last team, he says to Huggins, he said, "I got a boy that you really need to see. Someday he's going to be in the major leagues. He's a great hitter. Can I send him to you?" And Huggins and Babe Ruth looked at Baker and started laughing at him. And who you kidding, And it's like, bub, bub, bub. So Baker says, okay. And so he just quietly walks across the field, walks over to Mac and says, pretty much repeats the same thing. And Mac says, Bake, if he's as good as you say he is, I don't need to see him. Just send him to me. And so Baker sells him to the A's for $2,000, which he got really criticized for that because the townspeople thought that was pretty cheap for Jimmy Foxx. But anyway, Fox made his debut the next year as a 17-year-old, and as you say, the rest is history. But the way Baker tells it, the Yankees had the first choice and didn't even bother to give Fox a look-see. So I guess that was one that Mac smiled about for a long time.
Now, of course, the irony here is that when Mac was breaking up that first championship dynasty, Jack Dunn of the Orioles offered Babe Ruth to Connie Mack. And, of course, Mac didn't take it because he was breaking up the dynasty. So instead, the Boston Red Sox took the Bambino. So it could have ended up either way. But consider a lineup with, let's say, Jimmy Foxx, Babe Ruth, and Al Simmons in Philadelphia, because they were all contemporaries, or on the other hand, Jimmy Foxx, Babe Ruth, and Lou Gehrig in New York. I mean, no one would have been able to touch those teams, at least because you had those power-hitting duos broken up, Fox and Simmons in Philadelphia, and Gehrig and Ruth in New York. You had somewhat of a parity between those two teams, the A's and the Yankees. And, of course, as we know, the 1929 through 31 A's followed the 26 through 1928 Yankees as, world champs. So it's interesting how that worked out. Barry, I got one more question for you, and it's about Baker's post-baseball life. We know that a lot of these guys were hard livers, hard drinkers. Baker wasn't that way, but he did experience some tragedy in his post-baseball life. Tell us a little bit about that.
In 1920, Baker's wife, Ottilie, died at the age of 31 from scarlet fever. And at the time, he had two daughters, Ottilie, who was 9, and Janice, who was 2. And the reason he set out the 1920 season was he really didn't have a carekeeper for his daughters. And he said to the writers, he said, my daughters mean more to me than the New York Yankees, and baseball will just have to get along without me for a year. And I thought that was really, really powerful. And he did. He set out 1920. He did end up playing for Upland again. But again, that was like maybe 1 game, 2 games a week. So he wasn't really away from home. He did end up getting remarried, and but that was something that was very difficult for him to overcome. And matter of fact, it was unclear whether or not he would end up playing in 1921 and 22 for the Yankees because of that. And then the other thing to think about with Baker in his career, I mean, he played 13 years or so, but he set out 2 full seasons, 1915 and 1920. So it would be interesting to see if you added those 2 seasons to him, not as if he didn't already have a great career, but I think it would have been even better. But he did have to deal with the death of his wife and ended up taking care. I think his sister or somebody took care of the girls while he played for the Yankees.
We've been talking with Barry Sparks, author of Frank Home Run Baker, Hall of Famer and World Series hero, published by McFarland Books in 2006. You can purchase the book online at www.mcfarlandpub.com. and that's www.mcfarlandpub.com. Barry, thanks for being with us, and thanks for writing such an insightful book on Frank Home Run Baker. Very well researched, very entertaining, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, Bill, it was my pleasure to write the book, and I really enjoyed being on the show. And thanks for asking about Frank Home Run Baker.
Thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.